want to thank you all for coming out on such a cold evening. I got here at about 5 o'clock and I looked at the sunlight and I said, wow, this is really great. Then I remembered I was here about 4 years ago. I did a history of Howard Johnson's. What I've been doing over the last few years is not only writing about cities and towns, but I've also begun to do a series of books with the History Press. And I did, of course, the Baker Chocolate Company. I also did the history of Howard Johnson's, and recently the history of Jordan Marsh Department Store. But one of the concepts is the book I'm writing now is S.S. Pierce. And I think in some ways these are things that we remember of now lost either industries or department stores or even wonderful purveyors of fancy goods and libations. But if we don't record this history for our children and grandchildren, it's going to be lost. So local history is something that should be a lot of fun. Well, the Baker Chocolate Company, A Sweet History, was published by the History Press. Alan Sutton, who started what was Arcadia, and I know that Scituate has done an Arcadia book, would actually have started these about 35 years ago. Now what they've begun to do is not only have 80% text, but 20% photographs, but many of them in full color. So this book came to fruition about 4.5 years ago, and it was something that chronicled not just a sweet history, but also the oldest manufacturer of chocolate in North America. Well, chocolate is something in a lot of ways that we think of as a rich, creamy confection that not only few of us can resist, but the whole idea is it's something that is actually the end product. And when we think of chocolate, we have to realize in some ways that it derives from the Theobroma cacao tree. Now these trees are dwarf-like, they grow in very warm climates, and there are 24 distinct varieties. Each of the Theobroma cacao tree species have a specific flavor. So the 24 varieties can be combined to create something that's quite nice. But eventually it will become known as chocolate, is what we enjoy today. But during the period of the 15th and 16th century, chocolate was something that was known as cacao. And cacao was something that was not just a food for the gods, but it had its own god, Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was somebody, and you might think of chocolate as being something you worship. In this instance was a man who actually many people revered in the Toltec and Aztec cultures. This mask, which is in the collection of the London Museum, is something that would be worn by an honored village person. Because cacao trees had twice annually ripenings, the person would wear this and then bless the growing crop of the Theobroma cacao tree. Well, it didn't change. These cacao plantations themselves would go the gamut of anywhere from 200 to 500 acres. But by the period of the 16th century, you began to realize it was really quite well known. Well, this was a conjectural drawing that showed Hernandez Cortez on the left-hand side and, of course, Montezuma on the right. They stand in front of one of the Aztec pyramids. And what Hernandez does is actually give over a peace treaty, which was meaningless, and Montezuma gave the recipe for chocolatl. Now, chocolatl at that time was not sweet. It was a savory drink, and it was actually flavored with chili pepper and vanilla. And in that way, the savory drink was usually drunk out of a hollowed coconut shell, and it was reserved for royalty and aristocracy. And in that instance, it would then be taken by Cortez to Spain, and eventually became part of the dowry of the granddaughter of the King of Spain when she married Louis XIV of France. In that instance, it became known as Coco, and it was something that would be flavored not only with sugar and a little bit of vanilla, but it was something that was enjoyed in a sweet sense versus a savory one. Well, in 1728, this print shows the 3 choices of drink that were actually enjoyed by people across the world. On the left-hand side was a man from Arabia drinking coffee. In the center was a man from China drinking tea. But on the right was a Toltec warrior enjoying his chocolatl from a hollowed-out coconut shell. And if you notice, it has wonderful handles that are silver gilt, and that was something that showed how important it was. It was called the ambrosia of the gods. And in that way, it was something that was not only delicious, but created a wonderful history. Well, the derivation of chocolate was something that came from the Theobroma cacao tree. And the tree, as I said, was dwarf-like, anywhere from 12 to 15 feet in height. It was singular trunked from which branches extended. But the idea was it grew in extremely warm climates, anywhere from 20 miles north or south of the equator. So not only Central America, South America, the West Indies, and the Caribbean, but also Africa had cacao plantations. And in that instance, when it was grown, these would actually have, as you see here, pendles, or what were called cacao pods, not only from the branches of the tree, but even the trunk of the tree. And these were anywhere, as you would see here in a print of the 18th century, from 11 to 12 inches in length, 7 to 9 inches in diameter, and when they were broken open, would have individual cacao seeds, about the size of one's thumbnail. But the whole idea was that plantations had begun as early as the 15th century, and they were done on a methodical basis. They were actually serviced by groups of both men and women. And seen here in a photograph of 1900, the men in the distance actually have poles. And once the pod had ripened, they would knock the pole in such a way that the stem would break and they'd fall to the ground. The people in the foreground had wicker baskets that would collect the pods, and then they would be broken open. And seen here again in an 18th century print in the very center, there would be a membrane that actually connected upwards of 35 to 45 individual cacao seeds. As I mentioned, they are the size of one's thumbnail, but they would then be sorted. And it was not only children, but women that began the sorting. And seen here in a photograph of 1900, the two young boys in the foreground not only break open the ripe pods, but you would see on pallets all of the beans that were left to air dry. Because of the proximity to the equator, they would air dry in less than 2 weeks. And because they were dry beans, they had a shelf life of anywhere from 10 to 20 years with no adverse effect until you began to make chocolate. Well, that was the background, and that was what led to the production of chocolate in Dorchester Lower Mills. Well, Dorchester itself had been settled in 1630 by Puritans seeking religious freedom. They had come on the Mary and John, and they settled in a town that one time went from not only what is today South Boston, but to within 144 feet of the Rhode Island border. Dorchester included South Boston, Squantum, present-day Dorchester, Mattapan, Milton, Foxborough, Wrentham, Canton, Raynham, Sharon, Stoughton, and you would realize in some ways that it was the largest town in Massachusetts Bay Colony. But seen here in a map of 1831 drawn by Edmund Baker, the half-brother of Walter Baker who owned the chocolate mills, the Neponset River was named for the Neponset tribe of the Massachusetts Indians. Directly above the river, north, was Dorchester, and that was Dorchester Lower Mills. Directly below or south was Milton Village. And though Milton was part of Dorchester until 1662, the industrial beehive of what is today the Lower Mills was an important one because the river was harnessed for water power as early as 1634. In 1634, the first grist mill was actually opened by Israel Stoughton on the banks of the river, and all corn meal in Massachusetts was ground there. In 1678, the first gunpowder mill was actually on the Dorchester side of the river. In 1728, the first paper mills were at Unquity-Quisset or Mattapan, and in 1765, the first chocolate mills, which was the Baker Chocolate Company. And the story went that this was Dr. James Baker, the man who would eventually open the mill and subsidize a man named John Hannon. Baker himself had been educated in the Dorchester schools, and he later was graduated from Harvard College in the class of 1760. He himself, after 2 years of study, which one normally did to become a minister after having graduated from Harvard, decided not to actually preach the Word of God. He then taught school in Dorchester for 1 year, and he realized he didn't want to teach either. So the next year, after 9 months of arduous study, he obtained the title of Doctor of Medicine, a title he used until the day he died in 1825. But in 1765, he was actually keeping a general store, and what they called Baker's Corners, or what today is Codman Square in Dorchester. And there, according to the history of Dorchester, he met, quote, a penniless Irish immigrant, unquote, by the name of John Hannon. Hannon had no prospects in life and no money, but he knew how to make chocolate. And the idea was that here was Dr. James Baker, who had money, and set him up in production in a small mill on the Dorchester side of the Neponset River. The mill was only 1.5 stories in height. It had a water wheel utilizing the water power of the Neponset River, and there chocolate was produced between 1765 and 1779. And it wasn't known as Baker's chocolate, it was known as Hannon's best chocolate. And seen here in a wrapper, which was actually produced in the paper mills at Unquity-Quisset or Mattapan, a bar of chocolate would be wrapped in the paper, and these were ½ pound in size. Well, this was something that was the finest chocolate available locally. It was something that many people realized that John Hannon had made a fine product. And so proud of it was he that he actually had the paper embossed with the scales of justice. And on the lower portion it says, if the chocolate does not prove good, the money will be returned. And this is thought to be one of the first money-back guarantees on a food product in the United States. Well, between 1765 and 1779, Hannon did well. He married Elizabeth Gore of Roxbury, and they had a child. But he supposedly went to the West Indies in 1779 to get further cacao beans, and he never returned. A year later, the widow Hannon sold her half share of the Baker Chocolate Company to James Baker, and the House of Baker's Chocolate was incorporated. And in that instance, it would be 3 generations that actually ran the company's firm. Seen here, Walter Baker himself was not only the son, but the grandson of the founder. And like his father Edmund and his grandfather Dr. James Baker, he too had attended Harvard College. He graduated in the class of 1811, but he took a year to study for a law degree, which Judge Tappan Reeves in Litchfield, Connecticut. So when he became president of the company in 1818, he not only protected it legally, but he was somebody who was well equipped to run the family business. Bless you. In that instance, he was somebody who actually would increase the company 15-fold in less than 30 years. And during the period of the 1820s, it was an important feature to realize that this was a chocolate that was well respected, not just locally, but up and down the eastern seaboard. He created his own trademark, and his trademark was a young maiden with a cornucopia spewing forth different types of chocolate. And during the period of the 1820s, the company made about 5 different varieties, but one was called Premium No. 1. It was a chocolate that had an 85% cacao count. It was really one of the purest chocolates available. But they also made Coco, and they made Broma. Has anybody ever had chocolate Broma? Has anybody had Broma Seltzer? Well, Broma Seltzer is the same premise as chocolate Broma. But Broma was an effervescent drink, and iced chocolate was something that wasn't just refreshing, but on a summer day it was something that was delicious. And people in the 1820s through the 1880s would enjoy chocolate Broma. Well, in that instance, this trademark became known not only in Scituate, Massachusetts, but even as far west as Illinois. And you began to realize that many people looked at Walter Baker's Broma as not just a pure food, but something that was delicious. Well, seen here, this was a broadside. And it says in the opinions of eminent physicians of Boston that this is not only a delicious product, but it's actually good for you. Now, these physicians were among the leading men of the day, and you saw that Dr. John Collins Warren, the first man to operate at Massachusetts General Hospital with ether, was actually to head the list, along with George Hayward, John Holman, Walter Channing, Zabdale Boylston Adams, and John Ware. Each of these men were respected in the medical field, but they were also members of the same class at Harvard as Walter Baker. In that instance, they not only had an eminent opinion, but they also in some ways looked at Broma as a delicious substance. In that period, Walter Baker was making all sorts of different types of things, not just flavors of chocolate, but chocolate, cocoa, broma, cocoa paste, and even homeopathic chocolate. Now you had to realize chocolate is something that has a very high caffeine count. Sometimes it's double, both a cup of coffee and a cup of tea. But in this instance, with a reduced caffeine level, it was something that not only children, but seniors could digest easily. And in that way, it was something that was touted as being good for you and nutritious. Well, during this period, Walter Baker had done extremely well. But he died in 1852 at a really very young age. His son was living in London, and his daughter was living in Paris. They had no interest in the company except for getting an annual stipend. His stepnephew, seen here, was Henry Lilly Pierce. Pierce was working for his uncle as a counting clerk at $1.50 a week. Doesn't sound like a tremendous sum of money, but he was learning the business from the bottom up. He was very astute. He had attended not only Milton Academy, but he was graduated from the Bridgewater Normal School. So when he started with his step-uncle in 1849, he really did learn the business. When he became president of the company in 1854, he raised his salary to $20 a week, not a tremendous sum of money. But when he died in 1896, he left $71 million. He increased the company 40-fold, and by the turn of the 20th century, there were 3,600 people working 2 shifts daily. Henry Pierce was somebody who not only knew the chocolate industry, but would also give back to the community. He'd serve as mayor of Boston in 1872 and 1877. He served as a United States congressman from 1883 to 1885, and he would also travel the world inspecting other manufacturers of chocolate, not only in England and France, but Germany and Switzerland. When he inherited the Baker Chocolate Company, a company though he was president of, but was not allowed to buy outright by the trustees of the Baker estate until 1884, all he inherited was the building on the far left. It was the old stone mill, built of granite, thought to be impervious to fire, designed by Gridley J. Fox Bryant, a man who had made his claim to fame as building not only the Charles Street Jail, but the Massachusetts State Prison at Charlestown of granite. That was a small mill, 45, 50 people worked there at most. But what he set about to do was to increase the entire mill village by building eventually 11 mills that would actually be built between 1872 and his death in 1896. And in the center distance was the very first, which was the Pierce Mill. And the Pierce Mill was built in 1872 and designed by a man named Nathaniel Bradley. Now, Nathaniel Bradley was probably one of the best architects of mid-19th century Boston. He was wealthy in his own right, but in the 1840s and 1850s, he had made his name by designing the prototype for the South End row houses. Has anybody ever been to the South End and you have a red brick swell bay facade streetscape? They share the same zoning, height, setback, and building material. Well, Nathaniel Bradley designed the South End, and in that instance, he made himself even more money. By the 1870s, he chose to actually design in commercial structures. So the Baker Chocolate Company was actually a very good option. During his lifetime, he not only worked individually, but by the 1880s, he took into partnership 2 junior partners, and the company was known as Bradley, Winslow, and Weatherall, that would design 10 of the 11 mills. Well, in that instance, the first mill was the Baker Chocolate's Pierce Mill, named for Henry Pierce. Well, Henry Pierce built this 5 stories in height. It was built of red brick and sandstone lintels, Second French Empire, mansard roofs, crenellation at the top. This was the most sophisticated building imaginable. But you had to realize in 1872, Dorchester had only just been annexed to Boston. In 1870, the residents of Dorchester had voted to annex themselves as a neighborhood of Boston. Roxbury had already done it in 1868, And Dorchester, with a population of 12,000 people, would see 100,000 in 1900 and 250,000 by 1930. This was a building that was more urbane in any other design than Dorchester would ever see in that period. It was something that became the prototype of the factories. But it was on Adams Street and directly on the river, so the building could only go up. And in this instance, with street traffic in the foreground, wagons, horses and carriages, as well as dogs, which I love, is a great example of what was basically a factory within a residential neighborhood. Well, Henry Pierce looked at this as a major feature. And during the period of the 1870s and 1880s, many people had no idea that there were other manufacturers of chocolate in Dorchester and Milton. In 1765, we saw, of course, Hannon making chocolate that became Baker's in 1780. In 1795, there was Preston's chocolate. In 1843, there was Dr. Ware's chocolate. And in 1847, there was Webb and Twombly chocolate. You can imagine the little mills with the aroma of chocolate, so much so that it was called Chocolate Village. But Henry Pierce, who was making a profit every single year thanks to the employees, was somebody who invested his profits by buying out his competitors. And what he did was, every time he built a new mill, he named it after the former competitor. So this was the Webb Mill, which still stands at the corner of Adams and Elliott Street on the Milton side of the Neponset River. Each of these mills would represent in some ways the tremendous growth of Baker chocolate, and each of the buildings would actually be used for a specific chocolate, because by 1900 there were 21 varieties of chocolate being made by Walter Baker. In that instance, people looked at this as a major employer. It was the second largest employer on the South Shore of Massachusetts, the first being Fore River Shipyard. And seen here, leaving the Pierce Mill in 1898, were a group of women, and it was called the noon hour. It was their lunch hour. They worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, imagine, and a half day on Saturdays. So, of course, they're going off to get something hot for lunch. But the idea was that Baker's chocolate this time had a 60-40 ratio, 60% men to 40% women. And the women went the gamut, not only as stenographers and office work, but they also were people that would wrap the chocolate in the paper and affix a label and fill cocoa containers. A major job, and it was something in some ways that many of these women did for their entire careers. But the whole idea was, by 1896, and this is a great map that shows Pierce Square, named after Henry Pierce. On the right-hand side, you see not only the Ware Mill and Preston Mill, but you also see the Pierce Mill and the Adams Mill, and then again on the left-hand side, the Forbes Mill and Baker Mill. It showed in that instance each of these buildings were designed by Bradley or the successor firm of Bradley, Winslow, and Weatherall. And it was within that residential neighborhood of both Dorchester and Milton. Many people realized in some ways that the chocolate that they were making was touted to be not only the best available on the market, but a wide variety was still available. This is a bar of premium number 1. We know it was made as early as 1765. Premium number 1 had a high cacao count. So today, if you want something that's really chocolatey, the higher the cacao count, the more pure the chocolate. Well, premium number 1 averaged 85%. It was really the best and most expensive on the market. But they also made other chocolates, which included German sweet chocolate. It's still available in supermarkets today, but it has a wonderful story. It was made by a man named Samuel German, who was from England, not Germany. When he came here, he was Walter Baker's coachman, and he did that for 12 years dutifully. But in 1839, he wanted a job in the mills, and the idea was that Walter Baker gave him a job. He began making chocolate, but it was his ingenious idea to add sugar to the liquid chocolate mixture that would then be put into a mold to solidify. And in this instance, German sweet chocolate was the first readily edible chocolate that the company made. Well, during this period, Samuel German would actually get $1,000 as a bonus, which was really a tremendous sum of money in 1840. The unfortunate thing was it was 10 times his annual salary, so he was making $100 making chocolate. But German sweet chocolate was something that is still made today. They also made vanilla chocolate. Does anybody like white chocolate? Did your mother tell you it was really the most fattening chocolate you could eat? My mother did. Well, vanilla chocolate has no chocolate in it whatsoever. In the 18th and early 19th century, it was actually something that was made from cocoa butter. So when you refine chocolate, which is 50% chocolate and 50% cocoa butter or fat, the cocoa butter was usually discarded. In the 19th century, it would be sold to the cosmetic industry, especially for lipstick. But in this instance, by the late 19th century, Walter Baker's was actually making vanilla chocolate. It was white because it was made with fat, combined with sugar and flour and vanilla extract. And of course, as it says here, the smoothness, delicacy, and flavor, it's good to eat and good to drink. So not only could you enjoy white chocolate as a small or maybe a large piece, or in this instance, make white cocoa. And it was something that was really quite unusual. But they also made Caracas Sweet chocolate. And Caracas was much like German sweet chocolate, but the beans came from Caracas, Venezuela. Remember, anywhere north or south of the equator, all across the world. And Caracas, Venezuela happened to be very near the equator. Caracas Sweet was a darker chocolate, in that instance much more pungent. But of all of them, cocoa was 50% of the average annual sales in the 19th and early 20th century. And though it was actually sold as a breakfast cocoa, it was delicious even in the evening. And it was said that if one didn't have enough time for a full, nutritious breakfast, a cup of Baker's cocoa served the bill. Well, cocoa was something that was as delicious as all of the other chocolates combined. And in that way, many people began to realize that Henry Pierce was making a fine product and continuing the legacy of the Baker family. Well, during the early part of the 1900s, one would see in these photographs, when the beans arrived at Dorchester, they had come from Boston. Ships would arrive at the Boston port, and then by sloop, bags of cacao beans would be brought out to Dorchester. In this instance, they'd be put into either canvas sacks or boxes, and they'd be stenciled with country of origin and date. Now remember, they're dried, so the dried beans had a shelf life of 10 or 20 years, and until one was going to begin to combine them with other ingredients, they were perfectly good in storage. But when chocolate was to be made, it would actually be brought to this. Henry Pierce, who had traveled annually all over Europe inspecting manufactories of chocolate, brought these rotisseries and fulling machines from Germany. From the early 1880s, this was something that revolutionized how chocolate was made and allowed them to make 250,000 tons of chocolate annually. Along the top would be a conveyor belt. The beans would actually come into a rotisserie. The beans would be roasted and then brought down to a fulling machine where the outer casing of the dried shell would be removed and a glutinous substance that was 50% chocolate and 50% cocoa butter would be the result. And seen on the left-hand side, the men wear leather aprons to protect their clothing, but in the 19th century, this was something that would be allowed to air and sun dry. Once it was just a slab of chocolate, they'd be put into conching machines. And these conching machines would simply grind it 24 hours a day for close to 14 days. And at that point, the molecules would remove not only the cocoa butter, but the chocolate so that they could begin the production of whatever the chocolate was to be. And once it was made, then the bars of chocolate would be brought to the wrapping stations. I mentioned earlier, Walter Baker and Company had employed women since the 1830s. There were two sisters, Christina and Mary Shields, that worked at the company, and again, they wrapped chocolate in the 1830s and 1840s. But in 1843, they had employed a woman by the name of Martha Pond. Martha Pond would spend her entire career working for the company, and she was basically the keeper of the secrets. Remember, the chocolate could only be made to taste like the last batch if you did the exact beans from the different flavored Theobroma cacao trees. And she was always good at it, and she was good at her job. And she also wouldn't work anywhere else because she was a deaf mute. And in that instance, Martha Pond was somebody not only as keeper of the secrets, but who actually helped Henry Pierce to actually manufacture the delicious chocolate. Well, the women here would actually have bars of chocolate, ½ pound, 1 pound, up to 5 pounds, wrapped in paper, affixing a label, placed into a box, and then brought to shipping. Same situation with women actually filling cocoa tins. These women themselves would fill tins anywhere from ½ pound up to 5 pounds in size, fill the box, and it was brought to shipping. Now, shipping was located directly on the banks of the Neponset River, and the building still stands in the distance. In the foreground were horse-drawn wagons. These would actually have the chocolate distributed locally. But do you see the trains on the left-hand side? These boxcars themselves would actually go into downtown Boston on the spur of the Dorchester and Milton Old Colony Railroad. And there was actually a passenger railroad that connected Neyland Street in Boston with Mattapan Station. But in this instance, with this spur, they could bring bars of chocolate and boxes of cocoa in good weather, suspending July and August, into Boston, where it would be distributed north by Union Station, or what we know of as North Station today, or south from South Station. In that instance, chocolate was being shipped to Canada, as well as even as far south as Florida. And during that period, many people looked at that as something that wasn't just a delicious commodity, but it was competing against new American manufacturers of chocolate. Well, Walter Baker would make these enormous broadsides. This is 4 feet by 2.5 feet, and it shows American and vanilla chocolates. And you see this wonderful graphics of all the different mills themselves. This probably dates to 1849. And in that instance, Walter Baker and Company was spending a lot of money on advertising, not just for that, but also to produce what they called receipt books. We call them recipe books. But even in the early part of the 19th century, there were 12-page booklets that if you followed the directions by learning how to melt chocolate properly without burning it, you could combine it with other ingredients to make brownies or fudge, or maybe something a little more elaborate. But seen here, this was the booklet that was done for the centennial of the United States in 1876. It was 100 pages in length, full-color advertisements, and on the 4 corners of the cover, gold medals. Beginning in 1854, Henry Pierce entered Baker's Chocolate in worldwide competitions against Swiss, German, French, and English manufacturers of chocolate. He won gold medals, silver medals, and even bronze medals for the quality of his product. And in that way, Baker's was really quite well known. But these recipe books were filled to the brim. And you could do everything from Vassar fudge or Smith fudge or Radcliffe fudge. You could do Charlotte Russe, as well as simple saltines dipped into chocolate. Everything seemed delicious made with Baker's chocolate. But Henry Pierce wanted his own trademark, and his trademark was this, La Belle Chocolatier. In the 19th century, she was a real woman. Her name was Anna Baltouf, and she was the daughter of Melchior, who was a knight of the Austrian court. The family had fallen on hard times, and in 1765, she was serving chocolate in a cocoa shop in Vienna. Her future husband, who was actually the nephew of the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, saw her, fell in love, and of course, married her. He had her portrait painted as the chocolate server, so her husband, Prince Denrichsen, actually would hang the portrait in their palace in Vienna. They died both in 1825, childless, and the portrait went to the Gallery Alte Meister, which is now in Munich. It's the Royal Portrait Collection. And in that instance, she was known as Das Schokoladen Maiden. But Henry Pierce fell in love with the painting, and he had a copy made. And in 1881, he registered it as his trademark for the Baker Chocolate Company and renamed it La Belle Chocolatier. So it was embossed on every piece of chocolate, every box that was used for shipping, as well as for advertising. And this is a Coco service that I bought at Skinner a few years ago. Don't ask me why, I have nowhere to put it. It's in the cellar. But it actually shows La Belle Chocolatier along with 2 little cocoa cups and saucers. These were made by Meissen in Germany, but they also were made by Limoges in France and Shelley in England. In that way, every bar of chocolate and every cocoa tin had a small premium label. And if you collected enough, you too could have your own cocoa pot and cup and saucer. And if it was purported to be the best cocoa in the world, what better way than to stir it with a silver spoon? And again, these were given away as premiums. So by the latter part of the 19th century, the premiums would go the gamut of trays, cups and saucers, cocoa pups, as well as, of course, silver spoons, and recipe books. And in that way, many people began to not only appreciate Baker's chocolate, but also to avidly collect it. Well, during that period, from 1854 until the turn of the century, Henry Pierce actually would go to places like the Marshfield Fair, the Topsfield Fair, but he would also go to the World Exhibitions. And in 1893 in Chicago, the Chicago exhibition was the biggest of all. He had Carré and Hastings, one of the best New York Society architectural firms, design this pavilion. It was actually 2 stories in height, built of white marble, and it cost $60,000. Now, in 1893, a mansion in Scituate could be built for less than $6,000. And this was only intended to be for 9 months. But the whole idea was that when you ascended that staircase on either side, you came into a large room like this. And of course, the demonstrators would set up displays. There'd be tins of cocoa, bars of chocolate, and apothecary jars that would then be filled with chocolate bonbons made from the receipt books. So they go the gamut of not just solid chocolate, but filled with nuts or fruits or candy. And in that way, it was something that was quite delicious, but it was also a place that encouraged you to sample the chocolate. Now, the receipts in some ways were really quite good. The books themselves showed people how to actually make the things. And this woman, who was one of the demonstrators, would actually make a cake. The chocolate food cake was something that was not only delicious to look at, but she's making a wonderful fudge frosting. She would eventually cut that cake and encourage you to try it. And the idea was that with a cup of cocoa and a piece of cake, you couldn't go wrong. But in the 4 corners of the room were desks, and at each desk was a full-color postcard of La Belle Chocolatier that was pre-stamped. And you could send a postcard home to family and friends. I just tasted Baker's cocoa, and so too shouldn't you. Word-of-mouth advertising would make now Baker's known not just on the Eastern Seaboard, but throughout the Middle West. And in that way, these exhibitions were a major feature, and they were done annually. That was 1893. In 1907, in Williamsburg, Virginia, they would actually erect this small building on this tray. The architect was a man named Edwin J. Lewis, a very well-known Dorchester architect who actually specialized in first-period buildings. And in that instance, it was something that actually was brought back to Milton and re-erected and sold as a private home. But it's pictured on this wonderful little tin tray. But you'd also see in 1915 in San Francisco this wonderful Moorish place as an exhibition. A minaret in the center with cocoa and electric lights. But look at the pavilions on either side with the elephant heads. And of course, once you entered into this Moorish palace, there was as much cocoa and chocolate as you could possibly eat or drink. These were things that encouraged people not just to sample, but also in some ways to realize with other competitors, and think of them, Hershey's, Nestle's, there were many of them in this country, that Baker's was actually quite delicious. Well, in that instance, even at the small exhibitions like Marshfield or even the Topsfield fairs, they would set up small canvas tents, and demonstrators and men would actually be there to actually serve not just hot chocolate, but iced chocolate broma. And in this way, it was something that, again, people could actually go up free of charge and have as much as you wanted. Well, Henry Pierce continued to look at this as a major feature. He had young ladies, such as we see here in their teens. In the center, she holds a tin of cocoa. On the left, a tray embossed with Baker chocolate motifs, and on the right, a Shelley bone china cup and saucer, again, a premium. But it went the gamut of teenagers all the way to people in their 70s and 80s. The average ratio was 40 years of service. You began to see in some ways that each of these people had a specific job. Maybe some wrapped chocolate, filled cocoa tins, or they were demonstrators. Others sorted the beans, roasted the beans, made the chocolate. The whole idea was that Baker's even kept a wonderful horse barn that had over 144 horses up until 1915. But the big thing was the receipt book. And choice recipes by the 20th century was something that was done on an annual basis. And it didn't just have recipes. They also had articles. And many of them talked about the nutritional quality of eating chocolate. I loved it already. And the whole idea was it was all written by this woman. Her name was Ellen Swallow Richards. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of her. But she was a fascinating woman who talked about the nutritional quality of chocolate. Well, she graduated from Vassar College, and later she wanted to study at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She was interested in both biology and chemistry, and her master's was something that was not only thought a little bit daunting for a woman, but she would be the first woman to go to MIT. Well, when she arrived, they called her an experimental student. She was a novelty. How could a woman ever do a master's, let alone in biology and chemistry? But she came from a well-to-do family, and she had been tutored at home, and Vassar proved in some ways that she was above the normal for a woman in intelligence. Well, the whole idea was she married her professor, Ralph Richards. But in that instance, she graduated in 1883. And she now had a dual master's. She came from an extremely wealthy family, and during that period of time she realized that there was great privation in Boston. And she set up what were called soup kitchens in the North End, South End, and West End of Boston. And she would go to these soup kitchens and teach immigrant women how to make highly nutritious but low-cost soups and stews and rices, as well as breads, that could then be purchased by people returning home from a factory. And in that way, she subsidized them on an annual basis out of her private income for almost 25 years. And in that way, she looked at not only the nutrition of food, but the nutrition of chocolate as a major feature. And she did an article every year for Choice Recipes between 1887 and her death in 1911. In that way, many people looked at this as an important feature. Baker's was known and loved by everyone, but there were competitors. In 1900, Baker Chocolate wanted to do a calendar, and it would actually be from 1780 to 1900. And if one thought of every 20 years as a generation, there would be 6 generations of Americans that knew and loved Baker's chocolate. So in 1780, we see here the very first generation. It says, "My lady drinks her first cup of Walter Baker and Company's Coco." And it says that the house of Walter Baker and Company was founded in the year 1780 in Dorchester, Massachusetts. Well, Martha Washington looks down from the wall. A Cavalier King Charles Spaniel quizzically looks at us, and she drinks her cocoa from an export porcelain cup and saucer. 20 years later, or the second generation, the fame of Baker's cocoa grows with that of the young republic. It says that pure cocoa acts as a gentle stimulant and invigorates and corrects the action of digestive organs. Not only was it delicious, but it was good for you. And in 1820, to speed the parting guest, Walter Baker and Company's cocoa is known and served in every hostelry or inn. It says, on a journey you cannot take any refreshment so wholesome, sustaining, or delicious. And in 1840, doctors now recommend Baker's chocolate as a beneficent restorer of exhaustive power. Now get this, a perfect food preserves health, prolongs life, and of course soothes both stomach and brain. And I don't know if it's a fashion statement with the ribbon around her forehead, but she's being served chocolate by the spoonful out of a port glass. And in 1860, it's the fashion to take a cup of Baker's cocoa or chocolate after a constitutional. And it says that the people who make constant use of chocolate are the ones who enjoy the most steady health and are the least subject to a multitude of little ailments which can destroy the comfort of life. And in 1880, La Belle Chocolatier now enters millions of homes as the trademark of the finest chocolate and cocoa in the world. And it says that a booklet of choice recipes by Miss Parola and other noted teachers will be sent free on application to Walter Baker and Company. Well, the next generation was the sixth generation descendant. And if she continued to drink her cocoa and eat her chocolate, she wasn't going to keep that hourglass figure much longer. But no one else in the United States could compete against Baker's chocolate for 6 generations that had known and loved Baker's. Well, Henry Pierce was somebody who had done quite well, and seen here in a portrait that was done by Bonnet in Paris in 1893, this was a man who had gone from accounting clerk to the president of the company, and when he died in 1896, he left $71 million. He never married. He was a politician. He was well connected socially, but in a lot of ways, many people looked at him as somebody who was not only a success, but he credited his success to the people that worked for him. The provisions of his will gave over $50 million to charity. And the idea was that each of the major charities received $1 million each. And that was Harvard University, which he didn't attend, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which he didn't attend, the Museum of Fine Arts, the Homeopathic Hospital, which is now the BU Medical Center, as well as Associated Charities, which was a non-sectarian group that assisted those in need. To every place of worship in Boston, $3,000. And to every employee who worked for him over 1 year, $1,000 for every year of service. And the average was 40 years of service. Now in 1896, one could buy a very lovely 2-family house in Dorchester for about $4,000. That money not only allowed his employees, who he felt were the reasons for his success, to not only live a comfortable life, but also to educate their children and grandchildren. He left the remainder to his family, and they still live on it today. A year later, the company was sold to what was called the Forbes Syndicate, headed by J. Murray Forbes, a financier in Boston, but he kept a weekend house in Milton that's now called the Forbes House Museum. In that instance, the Forbes Syndicate bought it for $4.75 million. And between 1897 and 1928, the company did increase it 15-fold, but they did it through advertising. They targeted every aspect of American society, so it was from children to adults, but they did it in magazines. Liberty, Collier, the St. Nicholas magazine, Youth's Companion, and eventually Look and Life, would actually have these full-page, full-colored advertisements. And of course it started with children. Blonde, blue-eyed child. It says, now I have my Dolly, pretty soon I'll have my Coco. Well, if she was my daughter, she'd get Baker's cocoa, of course. Children loved it. But so too didn't fraternity men at college. They weren't drinking beer. One of their sisters arrives unexpectedly and sets up an improvised cocoa table. And of course, she's the center of attraction, a perfect food. And in that way, her brother and his fraternity brothers enjoy a cup of Baker's cocoa. So it's children, fraternity men, and of course the doughboys in France weren't drinking wine during World War I. It says somewhere the boys are drinking a Baker's cocoa toast to mothers, fathers, wives, or sweethearts, delicious as dreams of home. So the whole concept was it's every aspect, including theater actresses, a little removed from polite society. But in 1907, there's nothing so soothing, refreshing, and delicious after a strenuous night on the stage as a cup of Baker's cocoa. So it went the gamut of all sorts of people in society. But also, there were mythological figures. And now, Little Red Riding Hood approached Grandmother's house with a basket of Baker's cocoa and chocolate. So the whole idea was that these advertisements that were started by a man named Norman Price, who was the mentor to Norman Rockwell, were beautifully illustrated. But you smiled and some of you chuckled. That translates into sales. And in that way, bakers during that period continued to compete and made wonderful products. Well, in a lot of ways, during the Forbes Syndicate, the last building was completed. It was called the Administration Building. It was built in 1919, but it was designed by George Shepard. Shepard was a principal in Shepard and Stearns, and they'd already built 3 schools in Milton and the Milton Women's Club. And he was extremely adroit, but in this instance it was built of red brick with limestone. The interior was quite elegant. But this became the new president's office, as well as the office as well, and a small museum on Baker's chocolate history. At the top of the stairs, demonstrators would greet honored guests as they arrived with trays of cocoa, plates of brownies and fudge, as well as cookies, and they stand in front of a portrait by Norman Price of La Belle Chocolatier. 6 feet in height, it was finished in 1921 and still hangs there. But these honored guests might have been people that had invested in the company, but it also could have been the local Boy Scouts and Girl Scout troops that were encouraged to come, and they would come anywhere from 4 to 5 times a year because they could have as much cocoa and chocolate as they could stomach. And the idea was it was great publicity. Looking up the stairs, you began to realize that the interior was sheathed in white marble, a bronze balustrade, and of course that wonderful 6-foot-tall portrait of La Belle Chocolatier. Well, in that instance, the Forbes Syndicate had really done quite well. But in 1928, they sold the business. And the purchaser was called Postum Corporation, which later became known as General Foods. And seen here from a hot air balloon looking at the mills, you had to realize that they were bound by Adams Street in the center, which connected Milton and Dorchester, but also the river itself. Well, they renamed it the Baker Division of General Foods. And between 1928 and 1965, it was a major feature that not only made chocolate, but also began to revolutionize the original baking chocolate. Now, baking chocolate on the left-hand side was something that was perfectly serviceable. The only time you usually ate baking chocolate was 2 o'clock in the morning when there was nothing else in the house to eat. But on the right-hand side, the Baker Division of General Foods began to make not just readily edible chocolate, such as milk chocolate bars, but also on the top, sweet chocolate tablets. Well, sweet chocolate tablets were about the size of one's thumbnail. Milk chocolate covered in a candy. And if they sound like an M&M, they were an M&M, but they were never copyrighted. So today we could be eating a handful of sweet chocolate tablets. Well, in this instance, they did compete against other people. And in that instance, many people looked at Baker's chocolate as something that was still providing delicious quality chocolate. Well, in this wonderful advertisement, it says with the 2 children, "School is more fun after a baker's cocoa breakfast." Well, whatever the child was eating, it might be supplanted in some ways. I'd prefer a cup of cocoa. Delicious and very attractive, but it was nutritious too. Well, in the 1940s and 50s, you could even make a chocolate cake with Baker's cocoa. And the surprising thing was these advertisements themselves would even have the recipe. And what was Baker's? Chocolate makes it good. Bakers makes it best. And in that way, people looked at this as something that was really revolutionary. In the 1950s, they now began to make larger chocolate bars. And this was a 25-pound bar, just enough for the weekend. The idea here was that these were made for the confectionery industry. So they would buy bars, melt it, and then do hand-dipped chocolates. Really impressive, because they could actually do a dozen at a time. But in that period, they also revolutionized by making chocolate chips, both large and miniature. And here you see the chocolate chips themselves just simply coming out of a convection oven. It was something that was incredible, and they would roll out. But they also revolutionized how they filled cocoa tins. Now, the women wear drip-dry rayon uniforms that look like La Belle Chocolatier's uniform, but we see here that they're no longer tin, but cardboard that would be filled with cocoa. On a conveyor belt, these women could actually do upwards of close to 1,000 tins a month. Every time I see this slide, I think of the Lucille Ball of actually the chocolate. But this was a major feature, and there were dozens of women that worked on this thing. Well, this woman was Hazel Stanley, and she's receiving an award as being the fastest filler of cocoa tins in the history of Baker's chocolate. Now, she worked for the company for 42 years, and she's getting the award from Curtis Geiger on the right. Geiger was the president of the Baker division of General Foods. Well, Hazel Stanley and her husband both worked at Baker's. Between them, it was 87 years. But she's showing him how she would fill her individual tins of cocoa. Well, the surprising thing was, it was something that was to be proud of, but she got a week's salary as a bonus and a small brooch. And some people felt in some ways that that was something that was really quite nice. She did something that revolutionized how one filled cocoa tins. But he did it too. Curtis Geiger's name is probably not known to anyone, but Curtis Geiger had been educated at both Harvard University and he got his master's at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And when he came to Baker's chocolate, he created what was called a chocolate bab. Now, have you ever bought a bar of chocolate that's divided into 1-ounce squares? And it tells you to break 3 and melt it in a microwave. Well, that was Curtis Geiger's invention, to place liquid chocolate into a bar mold that's already been scored for 1-ounce bars. And in that way, she may have filled the cocoa containers quicker than anyone else, but he made our lives very easy by making them into 1-ounce squares. Equally, they were important. And that way, that was something that was really almost like a family operation. In the 1950s and 60s, Baker's was involved in Dorchester Day celebrations with a great parade, initially on Dorchester Avenue, but also on Washington Street. The demonstrators would sell tickets. Delaney Ford would actually sell this wonderful Cadillac, and maybe you would be the winner. But it was something that Baker's did annually because it was a great community effort. But you also saw in that way in the 1950s and 60s advertisements that would show you how to combine such things as, of course, the Baker's chocolate for this gorgeous 4-layer chocolate cake. So inexpensive, and it's the Baker's chocolate that makes its taste so luxuriously rich. The woman smiles. She knows it's true. She makes it. But you also would have the Baker's chocolate German sweet chocolate cake. And in 1957, a woman from Dallas, Texas, combined coconut and chocolate to make this into something that's become, in some instances, the pièce de résistance in some people's dinners. In that way, Baker's German sweet chocolate, started by Samuel German in 1840, was still being used in the 1950s, and even to this day. Each of them were representative of the beautiful thing of chocolate. But one of the things about cocoa was, though it was the biggest seller, it now became known as instant chocolate. And the new Baker's 4-in-1 is more chocolatey, and it mixes faster, hot or cold. So now you didn't have to combine it with sugar and milk and stir it over a small flame. Now you could actually simply stir it into milk. Well, in a lot of ways, the mills themselves after 1965 would be in an abeyance. The General Foods Division decided to move the operations to Dover, Delaware. They offered 2 years of salary to anyone who would leave Dorchester or Milton to go to Dover, Delaware. And in that instance, the mills were actually 10% used. There was Mark Bell's Furniture and Papa Bear Tours. But the idea was the administration building became the local welfare office. But by the early 1990s, there was actually a revamping of the mills as being repurposed for housing. So they had luxury condominiums and luxury apartments, but they also had moderately priced apartments, handicapped, disability, as well as accessible, and they also had artist lofts. So that where people to the tune of 3,600 people would work on a daily basis now has over 1,200 people living in a community of historic lower mills. Well, the book, The Baker Chocolate Company, A Sweet History, chronicles not just the history of the oldest manufacturer of chocolate in North America, but it tells the story of something that was an industry in lower mills that everyone knew, and probably our parents and grandparents enjoyed as well. In a lot of ways, it was a delicious memory from the past. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. Boy.